Shalom, everybody. Welcome back to the Baal HaSulam's Matan Torah with commentary by Rebbe Avraham Morechai Gottlieb. I'll be referring to as the Rebbe Shlita. We are in section 24, in the middle of page 121. Last class we talked about the time where we encamped at the bottom of Mount Sinai before the receiving the Torah, and how there are many allusions there to being one man with one heart, and allusions to the level of giving to give. We played with some gematries as well, and looked into all things that point to Yashar Keil, being Yisrael, being straight to the Creator. The header of this section reads, Israel is a gateway by which the sparks of spiritual refinement flow to the entire human race. Before getting to the Baal HaSulam's words, I actually think the best preface to this section is going to be a section from the Introduction to the Zohar by the Baal HaSulam, Hakdama Sefer Zohar in Hebrew. It's a beautiful English translation by Yehudah Cohen with her own commentary interspersed throughout the book. And she also has additions of the Rebbe Zitzal, the Rebbe Shlita throughout the book as well, making it a bit more rich than just the plain text from the Baal HaSulam. Though the plain text is also available for free to read in English on Sefaria. You just look at the Baal HaSulam, you'll find it there, Introduction to the Zohar. So I wanted to speak particularly about the notion of Israel being the gateway for the Shefa in the world, for the abundance, the light to come through us to all the nations. We learned that it's specifically, all the more so in this generation as we approach the end of our correction, through the inner aspects of the Torah, as we've so often spoken about in this class. So I'd like to read this section. There's 70 sections of the Introduction to the Zohar, and the last 5, or 6 that is, speak about the innermost aspect of the Torah and its relationship to Israel and the world, which I think is most relevant to this section in giving. So the Baal HaSulam says on bullet point 68, if you have this book, it's on page 263, the Tapestry of the Soul. From what we have already seen, it is easy to understand that the Torah, like the world itself, has an inner aspect and an outer aspect. Likewise, the one who occupies himself or herself with Torah has these two levels. So, to the degree that a person, when practicing Torah, strengthens and focuses on the innermost aspect of the Torah and its secrets, he or she gives strength in this measure to the innermost aspect of the world, which is Yisrael. Then Yisrael begins to fulfill its true function with respect to the nations who then value Israel's role amongst them. Then shall the words of the prophet be fulfilled, quote, and the people shall take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Yisrael will settle in the land of the Lord, from Yeshayahu or Isaiah 14:2. Similarly, quote, thus says the Lord God, behold, I shall lift up my hand to the nations and set my standard to these peoples. And they shall bring your sons in their arms, and your daughters shall be carried on their shoulders. And kings shall be your foster fathers, and their queens your nursing mothers. Also from Yeshayahu 49:22. There's an addition here, quick commentary on that, saying in other words, Yisrael, that is to say, the will to receive in order to give benefit, which is the highest level of our desire, receiving in order to give, will triumph over the will to receive for oneself alone, which will then act as support and handmaid to the will to receive in order to give benefit. Generally, when handmaid or terms similar to that are mentioned throughout Tanakh, it, as we see here, is referencing this lower level of our desire, being our desire to receive for itself alone. But we see in the end time, once we've corrected ourselves, so too the desire to receive, being the handmaid, will then be corrected and be able to serve appropriately in order to give pleasantness and goodness to the Creator, to others. All the same thing in essence. Because as we've learned, anything that we're giving to outside of ourselves is giving. So whether it's between man and man or man and God, relative to us, it's all the same because it's outside of us. At the same time, there's a different parameter where we do focus on man between man because we get feedback between people and we can ask and see how efficient we were in our giving, God willing. So we see here there's a very intimate relationship between Klal Yisrael, those who are already in the system, those who are already learning Torah and involved in its mitzvot. They are, so to speak, the inner aspect relative to the outer aspect of Yisrael, the outer aspect of Jews, meaning people who don't keep the Torah and its mitzvot. So it's all the more so incumbent upon those who are involved in Torah and mitzvot and live such a lifestyle to focus on the inner aspects, because it's directly related spiritually to the actual nation of Israel itself. So, we'll clarify more so. But, God forbid, the opposite could happen. A person of Israel might devalue the most intimate part of Torah with its secrets, which deal with the ways of our souls and their levels, devaluing also the intellectual considerations and reasons of the Torah, emphasizing instead the outermost aspect of Torah that deals with practical issues alone. If such a person ever concerns himself or herself with the innermost aspect of the Torah, he or she sets aside only a small portion of his time to it, not giving to it the attention it deserves, but treating it as if it were superfluous material. By behaving in this way, he or she lowers and degrades the innermost aspect of the world, the children of Israel, reinforcing the externality of the world over them, who are the nations of the world. Interesting. We involve ourselves in the body of the Torah, and only the body of the Torah, we strengthen the body of the world, which is the nations of the world. Meaning to say that if we're imbalanced, then that imbalance will manifest in the world, because we're all interconnected and we are the nucleus. We're the core where all abundance comes from. Amazing. With great power comes great responsibility. The Baal HaSulam continues, then they, the nations of the world, cast Israel down and despise the children of Israel, and consider Israel to be a superfluous entity in the world, of which there is no need, God forbid. Not only this, but these people further cause the outer aspects of the nations of the world, who are coarse people who damage and destroy the world, to prevail over the inner aspects of the nations of the world, who are the righteous amongst the nations. The saints and gurus of the nations of the world, who are holy at their level. These individuals are also suppressed and shut down by the power that the outer aspects of the outer aspect of the world has upon them and upon the world at large, as a result of our focusing on the outermost aspects of the Torah. They then cause terrible destruction, slaughter, and holocausts, such as our generation has been a witness to. God preserve us from here onwards. If I'm not mistaken, for good reason, given what he just said, Baal HaSulam wrote this introduction to the Zohar after the Holocaust. This was closer to the last years of his life. He wrote this as he left this world in 1954, 55. Therefore, we see that the redemption of Israel and all the worth of Israel is dependent on the learning of the Zohar and the inner aspects of the Torah. The opposite is also true. All the afflictions and degradations that have come upon the children of Israel are an account of their neglecting the most intimate part of Torah and not having valued it, but having related to it as something superfluous. God forbid. Then the next section in 69 quotes the Tikkun Zohar, Tikkun Lamed, section 30, in the second column. I'm just going to skip towards the end, just for time's sake and to clarify the point. It says, woe to those people who cause the spirit of the Mashiach, the Messiah, to depart and leave the world, unable to return to it. They make the Torah a dry desert without any moisture of inner understanding and knowledge. They confine themselves to the practical aspects of Torah, and they do not make any effort to try and understand the wisdom of the Kabbalah. They will not contemplate the innermost principles of the Torah and the deeper reasons for the mitzvot. Rather, you're a simple religious Jew, go to shul, go to synagogue, pray 3 times a day, learn a little bit here and there, do your parsha of the week, maybe a couple mishnayos, maybe a couple halachas. That's it. What more do I need? Our own tradition says very clearly we need a lot more. And it's not sufficient. And the confusion and darkness and craziness that the world is experiencing, particularly on a level of consciousness, is because of our neglecting of the innermost aspect of Torah. So the section of the Tikkun Zohar ends, woe to them. They cause by their actions. Which actions? The neglecting of the innermost aspects of the Torah. Poverty, war, violence, pillage, killings, and destructions in the world. This is a most bitter thing to hear because it gives, I don't know if power is the right word, but it gives a point to the anti-Semites of the world who blame the Jews for everything and say that we rule the world, that we have influence on banks and media and all these things. That's a surface level, and it could be. I'm not saying one way or the other, but I'm just saying it makes sense to paint the picture that because our innermost potential is of the most exalted status to be the gateway of light to the nations of the world, if we are not doing that, then that amazing potential is manifest in the opposite manner, meaning a most coarse, a most dark and lowly, egoistic level. So perhaps there is some truth to that notion of us ruling the world, because in truth, spiritually, it's not that we rule the world, but the world is ruled through our action. The Creator opens up the channels of His abundance, light, and the like through us. It's a relationship. It's a covenant. It's a Brit Kodesh that we made with Him. And it's our responsibility to be that partner in order to assist and teach the rest of His beloved children, because all of humanity is Tselem Elokim. We're all made in the image of the Creator, meaning we all have that potential to unveil that spark of giving within us. God willing, we'll be able to connect to the inner aspects of the Torah on a consistent basis and be able to refine ourselves slowly but surely. So, back to giving. Section 24 again. Header reads, Israel is a gateway by which the sparks of spiritual refinement flow to the entire human race. And as we just read in the introduction to the Zohar, that spiritual refinement that has flown to the human race is particularly, all the more so in this generation, through the inner aspects of the Torah. The Baal HaSulam says, thus, because of the above stated necessity to choose Israel, the Torah was given specifically to the Israeli nation, solely to the stock of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, for it was inconceivable that any stranger would take part in it. The Rishita says on the spot, it may be asked, haven't other nations endured various afflictions and subjugations? Why didn't their afflictions affect them so as to bring them to a state of fulfilling the Torah? Answer. Because the two above-mentioned factors are bound up one with the other. It is because Israel has a heritage of its nation's fathers as its spiritual genetics that the afflictions in Egypt operated to improve the quality of this heritage. However, for a different nation without this heritage, afflictions do not similarly advance them in loving the other. It can be added as well that if Israel had only the heritage of the fathers without the afflictions, also then they could not have arrived at the situation of the giving of the Torah. It says that man is a tree in the field. We grow towards the heavens. We grow towards Shemayim, towards the light, towards the sun. We grow through the water. Water is representing chesed and Torah. In the same way, a tree or any plant life is more efficiently grown in a place of good soil, good irrigation, good rain. And certain plants might have certain structure in their DNA that allows them to grow more so from certain environments than others. I think this is all that it's saying, is that because of the DNA, spiritual DNA of the Jewish people having the merit of the forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov Avinu, so being in a place of subjugation is most helpful in refining us. Whereas the nations don't have that. Perhaps the nations of the world today have a spark of Avraham, Yitzchak, or Yaakov, particularly Avraham, let's say Bnei Avraham, like Ishmael, the Arab nations. And surely we see lots of the chesed of Avraham manifests in those nations of the world. And the aspect of Esau, which we understand to be the European nations and their branches of the world and their conquest of power and money, as the Western world represents the aspect of Esau. And the Arab nations are a bit more content and peaceful relative to the hustle and bustle of Esau, though there, of course, is that very extreme side. That's another point. The principle that I just want to say is that both are coming from different aspects of chesed and gevura, the klipat of the right and the klipat of the left. The klipa of the right is Yishmael. I've heard the Rabbi Shita say, the right side is shleimus, the right side is completion. So it's the Arab chilling in the streets, a little bit of tobacco, nice music, maybe some food. That's it. It's all good. Whereas Esav, being the klipat of the left side, which is the side of receiving, the side of lack, chisaron, is conquering and acquiring to compensate. One side without the other is klipa. It's imbalance. So we need both sides in order not to be manifesting the aspect of Esau or Yishmael. Rather, Yaakov Avinu, which is in the middle. And Yaakov's higher status is Yisrael, Yasharkel. This is to paint the picture, to come back to the point that we read here in the introduction to the Zohar, of the imbalance we see in today's generation. with the focus on the outer aspects of the Torah. The outer aspects of the Torah are one side. So without the other, it's a klipa. And it brings the great darkness into the world, as we read. But it's never too late and we're never too far because of that heritage that we have in our spiritual DNA. And the suffering that we bring upon ourselves by the Creator's will for us to go through those motions of different levels and manifestations of subjugation and imprisonment. So through that, we come to the higher state that we desire in our innermost being of giving, loving, compassion, emunah, and the like. Given the above, the question arises, for what purpose are the nations of the world afflicted? The answer must be that the afflictions do advance them, but very slowly. Because they are not centered on the points of emunah and tzedakah, faith and charity, their afflictions do not naturally create a focus on improving these points. However, afflictions do certainly advance humanity, and without them, the nations of the world would never seek a different basis for their lives. It would never accept the way of life of Israel. But I think it's hinted that it is possible, because everyone on earth has that innermost spark, that innermost potential to come to Yashar Kel. It says in the Gemara, the world will spread, will become Israel. All of the world will be considered Israel at some point, perhaps alluding to Israel being the aspect of our inner consciousness of being L'Shem Shamayim, being Yashar Kel, everything intended to give to the Creator. And the world representing the nations of the world, representing our coarseness, Eretz being Ratzon, could be related to Malchut, our desire to receive. So it's perhaps saying that the entire body of our desires, particularly the ones to receive, as that's what makes up man, that's our chomer, that's our raw material, will be Israel. All of our desires will finally be Yashar Kel. The Baal HaSulam continues, indeed, because of this, the Israeli nation became set to be a sort of gateway by which the sparks of spiritual refinement would flow to the entire human race the world over. These sparks increase in number, day after day, like donations to a treasury, until they fill up to the desired amount. It is until people develop to such an extent that they can comprehend the pleasantness and the tranquility that are embedded within the kernel of loving the other. For then they will know how to tilt the scale to the side of merit and will place themselves under God's yoke. And the side of demerit will be eradicated from the world. Says the Rebbe Shlita, in the meantime, it is the nation of Israel that must be repaired. For at this stage, the spirit that rules in Israel is the spirit of the nations of the world, and not the spirit of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Therefore, it's not relevant at this stage that Israel occupy itself with pouring out sparks of refinement to the whole world. What matters first is that each of us is obligated to uncover the quality of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov within himself or herself. And by virtue of this, with God's help, there will also be a general change in the face of the Israeli nation. Then, afterward, the Israeli nation can bring about a change also in the nations of the world. First things first, we got to fix the family. The family is the Israeli nation. We're all brothers and sisters. It's true the nations of the world are also our brothers and sisters, but there is a level of relation here. Quite literally, I think I read a statistic way back when that at furthest, any one Jew is a 30th cousin of the other. Perhaps it's less, I don't know. But interesting to contemplate how we're all cousins. Anyway, as we've said many times before, We're all pieces of the puzzle. And if one piece of the puzzle is changed, objectively, the entire puzzle is changed. You add one little speck or one dot or one new color or erase a little part of any puzzle or painting and the like, the entire thing changes completely. So the best thing we can do in this gullus, in this exile, is to work on ourselves. As we fix ourselves, we fix the world. Because every man, every person, every Ben Adam is an aspect of the world and is a world in himself. Tov, thanks for joining me. Always a pleasure. Until next time. The header of the next class reads, where do we find in the Torah that the children of Israel were requested before receiving the Torah to accept the mitzvah of loving the other? And then in terms of just the pages themselves, about 10 pages to go. Maybe 9 technically, as there's questions for review at the end, which is always nice to go over. Getting there, slowly but surely. Before I part ways, I will check the YouTube, see if there's any questions or comments. No? So, all the best. Until next time.